They told the world I had lost my mind, but the only thing I ever lost was my faith in the man I married. And on the day I walked into that auction hall and bought back my ancestral home with £10 million of my own hidden fortune, I proved to every whispering tongue in London that Cordelia Ashworth had never been broken. I remember the morning they came for me as if it were painted in oils upon the walls of my memory, each brushstroke a shade of betrayal I could never have imagined. The autumn light had been filtering through the tall windows of Thornhaven Manor, casting golden patterns upon the oriental carpet my grandmother had brought from her travels abroad. And I had been sitting at my writing desk, composing a letter to my solicitor, when the door opened without so much as a knock. Reginald stood there with two men I did not recognize, their faces stern and clinical, and behind them hovered Dr. Bartholomew Pembridge, a physician whose reputation for treating ladies of nervous disposition had spread through the drawing rooms of society like a quiet poison. My husband's face was a mask of practiced concern, but I knew him well enough by then to see the satisfaction lurking beneath his furrowed brow. We had quarreled the night before, you see. I had discovered the documents hidden in his study, the ones revealing that he intended to sell the eastern fields of Thornhaven, land that had belonged to my mother's family for 6 generations, land that had come to him only through our marriage. When I confronted him with the papers clutched in my trembling hands, he had laughed at me. He had called me hysterical. He had said that a wife had no business questioning her husband's financial decisions, and that if I continued to make trouble, he would be forced to take measures to protect me from myself. I did not understand what he meant until that morning, when Dr. Pembridge approached me with a syringe, and Reginald watched from the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest. They carried me from my home in a private carriage with the curtains drawn, and I was too sedated to scream, too weighted by whatever substance they had injected into my veins to do anything but watch the familiar countryside blur past the small gap in the fabric. I remember thinking that the trees looked like mourners, their bare branches reaching toward a gray sky as if pleading with heaven on my behalf. I remember the jolting of the wheels over rough roads, the murmured conversation of the men who accompanied me, and the gradual darkening of the world outside as we traveled north, away from everything I had ever known. Briarcliff Asylum sat upon a windswept hill in Yorkshire, like a sentinel guarding the border between reason and madness. It was a handsome building in its way, constructed of pale stone that had weathered to a melancholy gray, with tall windows that reflected the perpetually overcast sky. When they helped me from the carriage, my legs unsteady beneath me, I looked up at those windows and saw faces peering down at me, women in white gowns watching the arrival of a new resident with expressions ranging from curiosity to complete indifference. I did not know then that I would come to recognize each of those faces, that I would learn their names and their stories and the particular sorrows that had brought them to this place, that some of them would become something like friends in the long months ahead. The interior of Briarcliff was clean and orderly, which I suppose was meant to be reassuring, but there was a coldness to its corridors that had nothing to do with temperature. The walls were painted a pale institutional green, and the floors were polished to a shine that reflected the gas lamps in wavering pools of light. Nurses in starched uniforms moved with purposeful efficiency, and the air smelled of carbolic soap and something else, something medicinal and vaguely sweet that I would later learn to associate with the sedatives they administered to the more difficult patients. Dr. Aldous Whitfield, the director of Briarcliff, received me in his office that first afternoon. He was a tall man with silver hair and spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling degree, and he spoke to me in the gentle, patronizing tone one might use with a frightened animal or a small child. My husband, he explained, had provided a thorough account of my condition. The hysteria, the delusions, the violent outbursts, the unfortunate incident with the fireplace poker which had required Reginald to restrain me for my own safety. I listened to this recitation of lies with a growing horror that must have shown upon my face, because Dr. Whitfield nodded sympathetically and made a note in the leather-bound journal that lay open upon his desk. I tried to tell him the truth. I tried to explain that there had been no violent outbursts, no incidents with fireplace pokers, that my only crime had been discovering my husband's plans to sell my family's land and daring to object. But the more I protested, the more Dr. Whitfield's expression settled into one of patient resignation, as if my denials were merely further evidence of my affliction. Denial, he told me, was common among patients suffering from hysteria. The first step toward recovery was acceptance. They gave me a room on the second floor, a small chamber with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the gardens. The window could not be opened, of course, and the door could only be locked from the outside, but Dr. Whitfield assured me that these measures were for my own protection. I would be comfortable here, he said. I would have time to rest and recover. And when I was well enough, when I had demonstrated sufficient improvement, I would be allowed to return home. I did not believe him. I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like winter cold, that Reginald had no intention of ever allowing me to return. As his wife, I was an obstacle to his plans. Confined to an asylum, declared incompetent by medical authority, I was no longer a threat. He could sell Thornhaven piece by piece, squander my inheritance on his gambling debts and his expensive tastes, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. The first weeks at Briarcliff were the darkest of my life. I wept until I had no tears left, and then I lay upon my bed staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, and wondering if madness might not be preferable to this endless gray existence. The other patients frightened me at first. Women who muttered to themselves or screamed without warning or sat in corners, rocking back and forth with their arms wrapped around their knees. I learned later that many of them had been committed for reasons as spurious as my own. Inconvenient wives, troublesome daughters, women who had dared to want something more than the narrow lives prescribed for them by society. We were all prisoners here, locked away because we had proven ourselves difficult. There was Mrs. Lavinia Thurston, a widow whose stepson had committed her after she refused to sign over her late husband's shipping company. There was Miss Georgiana Fawcett, a brilliant woman who had dared to publish scientific papers under her own name rather than a male pseudonym. There was Lady Millicent Ashby, whose only crime had been falling in love with a man her father deemed unsuitable. Each woman had her own story, her own tragedy, her own quiet courage in the face of circumstances designed to break her spirit. I came to know them slowly, these fellow inmates of mine, and their stories became woven into my own understanding of the world. We were not mad, most of us. We were simply women who had refused to be silent, who had dared to want something more than the lives prescribed for us, who had proven ourselves inconvenient to the men who held power over our fates. The days at Briarcliff followed a rigid routine that I learned to navigate with the precision of a sailor reading the stars. We rose at 6 o'clock to the sound of a bell that echoed through the corridors like the tolling of a church summoning the faithful to prayer. Breakfast was served in the dining hall at 7, a dreary affair of porridge and weak tea that I forced myself to eat even when my stomach rebelled against the thought of food. The mornings were devoted to what Dr. Whitfield called therapeutic activities, which consisted mainly of needlework and light gardening, tasks designed to occupy our hands while leaving our minds free to contemplate our supposed afflictions. The afternoons brought individual sessions with the doctors, interrogations disguised as consultations in which we were encouraged to examine our thoughts and feelings for signs of the hysteria that had brought us here. I learned quickly that disagreement was interpreted as defiance, that insisting upon my sanity only convinced them of my delusion. And so I began to play the game they expected, to nod along with their pronouncements, to express gratitude for their care, to become the compliant patient they wished me to be. But human beings are resilient creatures, and even in the depths of despair, something within me refused to surrender entirely. I began to observe my surroundings with more attention, to note the routines of the nurses and the habits of the doctors, to identify which members of the staff were kind and which were cruel. I made myself eat the bland institutional food, forced myself to walk in the gardens during the brief periods when patients were permitted outside, and slowly, gradually, I began to adapt to my circumstances. It was during one of those garden walks that I met Emmeline Fairfax for the first time since my confinement. She had been my lady's companion for 3 years before my marriage, a quiet, intelligent woman of gentle birth who had found herself in reduced circumstances after her father's death. We had parted on good terms when I married Reginald, and though we had exchanged occasional letters, I had not seen her in person for nearly 4 years. When she appeared on the garden path that October afternoon, wearing a modest traveling dress and a determined expression, I thought at first that I must be hallucinating. "Cordelia," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "Oh, my dear friend, what have they done to you?" I do not know how long we stood there in the garden, clutching each other's hands and weeping. Emmeline explained that she had heard rumors of my commitment through a mutual acquaintance and had spent weeks attempting to discover where I had been taken. She had written to Reginald, who had refused to see her. She had contacted my family solicitor, who had informed her regretfully that he was no longer authorized to discuss my affairs. Finally, through a combination of persistence and luck, she had learned of Briarcliff and had traveled north to see for herself whether the rumors were true. "You are not mad," she said, gripping my hands with a fierceness that made me want to weep all over again. "I know you, Cordelia. I know you better than anyone. And I swear to you, I will not rest until you are free of this place." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that escape was possible, that there was some path out of this nightmare that did not require me to submit to Reginald's version of reality, to accept the label of madwoman and spend the rest of my days in drugged compliance. But I had learned by then how thoroughly the law protected husbands from their wives, how easily a woman's voice could be silenced, how powerless I truly was. Emmeline visited me again, and then again, always bringing small gifts that the nurses sometimes allowed me to keep. Books mainly, and writing materials, and once a pressed flower from the garden at Thornhaven that made me cry for hours after she left. She told me news of the outside world, of the political upheavals and society scandals that seemed so distant from my asylum existence, and she listened patiently while I poured out my frustrations and fears. But it was during her 5th visit, on a gray December afternoon when snow was beginning to fall outside the windows, that she told me something that changed everything. "Your grandmother's trust," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Do you remember it?" Of course I remembered. My maternal grandmother, Lady Honoria Pemberton, had been a formidable woman who trusted no one, least of all the men her female descendants might marry. Before her death, she had established a trust in my name, administered by a Swiss banking concern that operated beyond the reach of English law. The trust had been meant for emergencies, for situations in which I might find myself in need of resources that no husband could control or claim. I had almost forgotten about it in the years since my marriage, had assumed that Reginald must have found some way to access it, but Emmeline's expression told me otherwise. "He knows nothing about it," she continued. "Your grandmother was very careful. The trust is held under a different name, and the only documentation is stored in Geneva. I have been in contact with the bankers, Cordelia. The funds are substantial, more than substantial." I felt something stir within me then, something that had been dormant for months, buried beneath the sedatives and the despair and the crushing weight of helplessness. It was hope, that fragile and dangerous thing, and though I tried to suppress it, tried to remind myself that hope had betrayed me before, I could not quite extinguish its flickering flame. We began to plan. It could not be rushed, Emmeline warned me. We had to be careful, had to move slowly and quietly, had to ensure that when I finally made my escape, there would be no possibility of recapture. She introduced me, through letters, to a solicitor named Benedict Harcourt, a man of unimpeachable reputation who specialized in cases involving women's property rights. Mr. Harcourt was cautious at first, uncertain whether to believe the story Emmeline told him, but after reviewing the documentation she provided, After examining the circumstances of my commitment and the suspicious timing of Reginald's actions, he agreed to take my case. Mr. Harcourt proved to be a remarkable ally. He was a man in his middle years, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a manner that was both businesslike and compassionate. In his letters, which Emmeline delivered to me hidden within the pages of books, he explained the legal complexities of my situation. As a married woman, I had no separate legal existence from my husband. My property was his property, my voice was silenced by his authority, and my commitment to an asylum was entirely within his rights as my lord and master. But there were loopholes in the law, Mr. Harcourt explained, narrow passages through which a determined woman might slip to freedom. The trust established by my grandmother was one such loophole, its funds held beyond the reach of English courts in the vaults of a Swiss banking house. And my commitment itself, based as it was on false testimony and fraudulent medical opinions, might be challenged if the right evidence could be gathered. Emmeline became my intermediary in this delicate dance, carrying messages between Mr. Harcourt and myself, gathering documents and depositions from servants who had witnessed the truth of my marriage, building a case that would eventually, we hoped, restore me to freedom and vindicate my name. The months that followed were a strange twilight existence, outwardly compliant while inwardly seething with plans and possibilities. I attended Dr. Whitfield's sessions without protest, nodded along to his theories about female hysteria and the dangers of excessive education, swallowed the medicines they gave me even though they made my head feel stuffed with cotton. I wanted them to believe I was improving, that their treatments were working, that I was becoming the docile, submissive creature they thought a woman should be. And slowly, gradually, the surveillance around me began to relax. It was Emmeline who brought me the news of Reginald's death. She arrived at Briarcliff on a March morning when the first tentative signs of spring were beginning to show in the gardens, and her face was pale but composed as she took my hands in hers. "There was an accident," she said. "His carriage overturned on the London road 3 days ago. He did not survive." I waited for grief to come, for some echo of the love I had once believed I felt for my husband. But there was nothing. Only a vast, hollow silence, and beneath it, like a river running underground, a current of something that might have been relief. I was a widow now. The law that had bound me to Reginald, that had given him power over my person and my property and my very sanity, had been dissolved by death. But freedom was not so simple. Reginald had died in debt, Emmeline explained, his gambling and his extravagances having finally caught up with him. Thornhaven and all its contents were to be sold at auction to satisfy his creditors. The estate that had been in my mother's family for generations, the home where I had spent my childhood summers, the gardens where I had learned to walk, and the library where I had learned to love books, all of it would be parceled out to the highest bidders, scattered to the four winds, while I remained locked away in an asylum, legally incompetent and unable to intervene. "Unless," Emmeline said, and her eyes met mine with a fierce intensity, "you are no longer here when the auction takes place." The escape itself was almost anticlimactic after so many months of planning. Emmeline had obtained the necessary documents through Mr. Harcourt, forged papers identifying me as a visitor who had overstayed her welcome and was now being discharged into the care of a distant relative. The night nurse, a young woman named Agnes, who had shown me small kindnesses throughout my imprisonment, had agreed to look the other way in exchange for a sum that would allow her to leave service and open a small shop in her home village. I spent the final day at Briarcliff in a state of tightly controlled terror, certain that something would go wrong, that someone would discover our plan and sound the alarm. Every footstep in the corridor made my heart pound. Every glance from a nurse or doctor seemed to carry accusation. I forced myself to follow my usual routine, attending meals and therapy sessions, pretending to be the docile, compliant patient they expected me to be. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I watched the light change outside my window, marking the progression of the day from morning to afternoon to evening, willing time to move faster while simultaneously dreading what was to come. What if Emmeline did not arrive? What if Agnes changed her mind? What if Dr. Whitfield chose this particular night to make an unexpected round of the wards? But nothing went wrong. When darkness fell and the asylum settled into its nighttime quiet, Agnes appeared at my door with a finger pressed to her lips and a lantern in her hand. She led me through corridors I had walked 100 times before, past the rooms where other women lay sleeping or staring at the ceiling or weeping softly into their pillows. I wanted to stop, to wake them, to bring them all with me into freedom, but I knew that was impossible. The best I could do was escape and then work to change the system that had imprisoned us all. Emmeline arrived at Briarcliff on the appointed night with a carriage waiting beyond the gates and a generous bribe for the night nurse who had proven sympathetic to my situation. I walked out of that asylum in a borrowed cloak, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the whole world must hear it. And when the carriage door closed behind me and the horses began to move, I wept with a joy so overwhelming it was almost indistinguishable from pain. The night air was cold against my face as the carriage picked up speed, and I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the dark shape of Briarcliff recede into the distance. 2 years of my life I had spent within those walls. 2 years of sedatives and sessions, and the constant grinding awareness that I was considered less than human, that my voice meant nothing, that my fate was in the hands of men who cared nothing for my well-being. Never again, I whispered into the darkness. Never again will I allow anyone to have that power over me. Emmeline reached across the carriage and took my hand. "You are free, Cordelia," she said. "You are finally free." We traveled through the night and into the next day, stopping only to change horses and to send telegrams to Mr. Harcourt confirming our progress. Emmeline had arranged lodgings in London, a modest but respectable house in Kensington where I could remain hidden while we finalized our plans for the auction. The newspapers, she told me, were already speculating about the sale of Thornhaven. It was to be handled by Christie's, that most prestigious of auction houses, and the catalogue included not only the estate itself, but all its furnishings, all its artwork, all the accumulated treasures of 6 generations of my mother's family. The house in Kensington became my sanctuary during those final weeks before the auction. It was small and simply furnished, a far cry from the grandeur of Thornhaven, but it was warm and safe and utterly private. I spent my days reading the newspapers, following the speculation about the sale with a mixture of dread and determination. I spent my evenings reviewing the auction catalogue with Emmeline, planning our strategy for the day that would determine my future. Mr. Harcourt visited frequently, updating me on the legal proceedings he had initiated and advising me on the complex arrangements required to bid at the auction without revealing my identity. The Swiss bankers had been cooperative, he reported, agreeing to transfer the necessary funds through a series of intermediary accounts that would be impossible to trace back to me. A holding company had been established in my name, its ownership documents sealed and protected by the same banking laws that had kept my grandmother's trust beyond Reginald's reach. Reading that catalogue was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Each item listed brought memories flooding back, vivid and sharp as broken glass. The Chippendale chairs from the drawing room where my grandmother had taught me to pour tea. The landscape paintings my grandfather had collected during his travels through Italy. The library of rare books that had been my sanctuary during long childhood summers, where I had discovered Shakespeare and Milton and the romantic poets who had shaped my understanding of the world. All of it reduced to lot numbers and estimated prices, waiting to be sold to strangers who would never know the stories these objects held. There was the music box that had played lullabies at my bedside when I was a child, a delicate Swiss mechanism housed in a case of inlaid rosewood. There was the tea service that had been a wedding gift to my great-grandmother, Sèvres porcelain painted with roses that seemed to bloom even in the pale light of winter. There was the writing desk where my mother had composed her letters, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, its secret drawers still holding the faded ribbons and dried flowers she had treasured. I wept over that catalogue, mourning not just the loss of objects, but the loss of the life they represented. The girl I had been, innocent and hopeful, dreaming of a future that would never come to pass. The woman I might have become, if I had been allowed to grow and flourish in the home that should have been mine. The family I would never have, the traditions I would never pass on, the memories that would scatter to the four winds along with the possessions that had anchored them. But I also felt something else as I read through those pages, something fiercer and more determined. These things had belonged to my family. They were my inheritance, my birthright, my connection to the women who had come before me. And if I could not save them all, I could at least save the most important thing of all. But there was one item in that catalogue that mattered more than all the rest. Lot 247, Thornhaven Manor and Estate, comprising the main house, 300 acres of parkland and farmland, the village of Lesser Thornton, and all associated rights and privileges. Estimated value, £10 million. It was an enormous sum, beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest families in England. But my grandmother had been a canny investor, and the Swiss bankers who managed her trust had been equally shrewd in the decades since her death. When Emmeline showed me the statement of my current holdings, I had to read the figures 3 times before I could believe them. "I have enough," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have more than enough." The question was how to use it without revealing my identity. Reginald's creditors would object violently to the notion of his widow buying back the estate that should rightfully have satisfied their claims. And there were those in society who still believed the story of my madness, who would seize upon my reappearance as evidence that a dangerous lunatic had escaped confinement. We needed a strategy that would protect me while still allowing me to achieve my goal. Mr. Harcourt was the one who suggested the veil. "Attend the auction in person," he said during one of our clandestine meetings in his chambers. "But attend in disguise, a wealthy widow from the continent perhaps, seeking an English country estate. The Swiss bankers can arrange for the funds to be transferred through intermediary accounts, and the purchase can be made in the name of a holding company that will later be revealed to belong to you." It was a bold plan, perhaps even a reckless one. But I had spent 2 years in an asylum being told that I was mad, being treated as if my thoughts and desires and very existence were inconvenient obstacles to be managed rather than respected. I was done being cautious. I was done being invisible. I wanted to walk into that auction hall and buy back my home with my own hands, and I wanted every person present to wonder who this mysterious woman might be. The morning of the auction dawned gray and drizzly, typical April weather that matched my mood of nervous anticipation. Emmeline helped me dress in the black silk gown we had purchased for the occasion, elegant and expensive, but not ostentatious, the sort of dress a wealthy continental widow might wear. The veil was made of the finest black lace, thin enough to see through but thick enough to obscure my features, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back at me. A woman of mystery and means, a woman no one would dare to question or dismiss. My hands trembled as I adjusted the veil, and Emmeline noticed, reaching out to steady me with a grip that was both gentle and firm. "You can do this," she said, her voice low and intense. "You have survived 2 years in that place. You have endured things that would have broken most people. This is nothing compared to what you have already overcome." I nodded, drawing strength from her certainty, and when we descended to the waiting carriage, I felt something shift within me. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it was joined by something else, something fiercer and more primal. This was my home they were selling, my family's legacy, and I would be damned if I would let it slip through my fingers without a fight. The streets of London were busy, despite the weather, carriages and pedestrians jostling for space on thoroughfares slick with rain. I watched through the carriage window as we passed through neighborhoods I had once known well, past the townhouses of families who had been friends or acquaintances, past the parks where I had walked as a young woman dreaming of the future. How different that future had turned out to be. How little the girl I had been could have imagined the woman I had become. The auction was held in the Great Hall at Christie's, a magnificent space filled with the cream of London society and the wealthy collectors who had come to bid on the treasures of Thornhaven. I entered through a side door and took a seat near the back, my gloved hands folded in my lap and my heart racing beneath my composed exterior. The auctioneer, a portly man with impressive whiskers, was already working through the earlier lots, and I watched as item after item from my family home was sold to strangers. There was Lady Prudence Darlington, a notorious collector of antiquities, bidding aggressively on a set of Roman bronzes my grandfather had acquired in Naples. There was Sir Horace Blackwell, a railway baron with more money than taste, purchasing a suite of Louis XV furniture that had belonged to my great-grandmother. There was old Lord Chelmsford, who had known my parents and who must have felt some twinge of conscience as he bid on the portrait of my mother that had hung in the main gallery for as long as I could remember. I watched them all, these vultures picking over the carcass of my family's legacy, and I felt a cold fury building within me that I had to struggle to contain. But I held my peace and waited. The hours crawled past, lot after lot going under the hammer, and finally, as the afternoon light began to fade through the tall windows, the auctioneer announced the final item of the day. Lot 247, he intoned, consulting his notes. Thornhaven Manor and Estate, Yorkshire. A most exceptional property, ladies and gentlemen, comprising one of the finest examples of Georgian architecture in the north of England. Shall we begin the bidding at £5 million? The room stirred with interest. Several paddles went up immediately, and the bidding climbed rapidly through 6 million, 7 million, 8. I remained still, watching, waiting, calculating. Let them exhaust themselves, Emmeline had advised. Let them believe they might actually win. At 9 million, the field had narrowed to two serious contenders. Sir Horace Blackwell, who had apparently not been satisfied with the furniture and now wanted the house that contained it, and a gentleman I did not recognize, a tall man with dark hair and a severe expression who bid with quiet determination from the front row. I studied him as the bidding continued, wondering who he was and why he wanted my home so badly. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of my memory, but I could not place him. 9,500,000, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 9,006,000? Sir Horace raised his paddle. 9,600,000. Do I hear 9,007,000? The dark-haired gentleman raised his. Back and forth they went, the numbers climbing toward 10 million, and I felt my pulse quickening with each bid. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I would finally reclaim what was mine. I raised my paddle for the first time. £10 million, I called out, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, steady and clear despite the turmoil within. The room fell silent. Every head turned to look at the mysterious veiled woman in the back row who had just raised the bidding by £400,000 in a single stroke. Sir Horace's face went red with indignation, and even the dark-haired gentleman seemed taken aback. The auctioneer peered at me over his spectacles, as if uncertain whether to take my bid seriously. £10 million, he repeated slowly. Do I hear 10,100,000? Sir Horace hesitated, glancing at his companion as if seeking advice. The dark-haired gentleman studied me with an intensity that made me want to look away, but I held my ground, my chin lifted, and my hands steady on my paddle. After a long moment, Sir Horace shook his head and lowered his paddle in defeat. The auctioneer turned to the dark-haired gentleman. Sir, do you wish to continue? The gentleman's gaze remained fixed on me for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he lowered his own paddle. Going once, the auctioneer said, and the words seemed to echo through the silent hall. going twice. Sold to the lady in the back for £10 million. I do not remember leaving the auction hall. I do not remember the congratulations of the Christie's officials, or the curious stares of the other bidders, or the paperwork that Emmeline and Mr. Harcourt handled on my behalf. I remember only standing on the street outside as the rain began to fall in earnest, tilting my veiled face up to the sky and letting the drops mingle with my tears. Thornhaven was mine again. After everything, after the betrayal and the imprisonment and the long, dark months of despair, I had won. The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and newspaper speculation. The mysterious buyer of Thornhaven Manor was the talk of London society, and rumors proliferated wildly. She was a Russian countess, some said, fleeing political turmoil in her homeland. She was an American heiress, said others, seeking to establish herself in English society. She was the secret mistress of a foreign prince, the widow of an Indian Maharaja, the daughter of a shipping magnate who had made his fortune in the China trade. No one, it seemed, suspected the truth. Mr. Harcourt worked tirelessly to secure my legal position, gathering evidence of my wrongful commitment and presenting it to the appropriate authorities. Dr. Whitfield, when questioned, proved remarkably reluctant to defend his diagnosis, and Dr. Pembridge, the physician who had first declared me hysterical, suddenly remembered urgent business on the continent that required his immediate attention. One by one, the supports of Reginald's fiction crumbled away, and within a month I was officially declared to be of sound mind and restored to full legal competence. It was only then that I dared to return to Thornhaven. The journey north was very different from the one I had made 2 years earlier, sedated and helpless in the back of a closed carriage. This time I traveled in comfort, with Emmeline beside me and the early May sunshine streaming through the windows. The countryside grew more beautiful with each passing mile, the rolling hills of Yorkshire rising green and gold against a sky washed clean by recent rains. And when the carriage finally turned into the long drive that led to Thornhaven, when I saw the house rising before me with its graceful Georgian facade and its ranks of tall windows gleaming in the afternoon light, I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. I felt like I was coming home. The driver brought the carriage to a halt before the main entrance, and for a long moment I simply sat there, staring up at the house I had thought I would never see again. The ivy that had always climbed the eastern wall had been neglected in my absence, sending tendrils across windows that should have been clear. The gardens that my grandmother had designed with such care were overgrown, the rose bushes unpruned, and the ornamental hedges ragged. But the bones of the place remained, the proportions and grace that had made Thornhaven one of the most beautiful houses in Yorkshire. Emmeline touched my arm gently. "Are you ready?" she asked. I was not certain I would ever be ready, but I nodded anyway and allowed her to help me from the carriage. My legs felt unsteady as I walked up the stone steps to the front door, and when I pushed it open and stepped into the entrance hall, the smell of dust and disuse enveloped me like a shroud. The house was empty, of course. All its furnishings had been sold at auction. All its artwork and books and treasures dispersed to new owners across England and beyond. But the walls remained, the bones of the place that had sheltered my family for generations, and as I walked through the echoing rooms, I began to imagine how I might fill them again. The drawing room, where my grandmother had held her famous salons, was a hollow shell of bare walls and exposed floorboards. The dining room, where I had sat at the head of the table as a young bride, was stripped of everything except the built-in sideboard that had been too heavy to move. The library, my beloved library, was the hardest to see. The shelves that had once held thousands of volumes stood empty, and the window seat where I had spent countless hours lost in stories was covered in a layer of dust. I sank down onto that window seat and wept, not with despair this time, but with a complicated mixture of grief and relief and hope. The books were gone, but I could acquire new ones. The furniture was gone, but I could purchase more. What mattered was that I was here, in this place that held my history and my heart, and that no one could ever take it from me again. Not with the same objects, perhaps, but with new ones. New books for the library, new paintings for the galleries, new carpets and curtains and comfortable chairs. Thornhaven had been stripped bare, but it could be restored. I could restore it. I spent my first night in the house sleeping on a makeshift bed of blankets in what had been my childhood bedroom, and I woke the next morning to birdsong and sunlight and a sense of peace I had not known in years. There was work to be done, so much work, but for the first time since my imprisonment, I felt equal to the task. The weeks that followed were filled with the practical details of reclaiming my life. I hired servants to staff the house and groundskeepers to tend the neglected gardens. I engaged decorators to help me furnish the empty rooms and architects to repair the damage that 2 years of neglect had wrought. I answered the letters that began to arrive from curious neighbors and distant relatives, carefully worded inquiries that sought to determine whether the rumors were true, whether the Duchess of Ravensdale had really returned from whatever exile or illness had kept her hidden for so long. I was not entirely sure how to answer those letters at first. Part of me wanted to tell the whole truth, to expose Reginald's cruelty and the complicity of the doctors who had imprisoned me, to name and shame everyone who had participated in my suffering. But Mr. Harcourt counseled caution. The truth, he reminded me, was complicated, and society was not always kind to women who made accusations against their dead husbands. Better to let the rumors fade naturally, to present myself as a widow who had suffered a period of poor health and who had now recovered sufficiently to resume her place in the world. It was sound advice, and I followed it. But there was one person whose curiosity I found myself unable to dismiss so easily, and that was the dark-haired gentleman from the auction. His card arrived 3 weeks after my return to Thornhaven, delivered by a footman in the distinctive livery of a neighboring estate. Lord Sebastian Wyndham, Earl of Hartwell, it read, and beneath the name, in elegant script, I hope you will forgive my presumption in calling upon you. I have a matter of some importance to discuss. I knew the name, of course. The Wyndham family had been neighbors of ours for generations, their estate at Hartwell Court lying just 5 miles to the east of Thornhaven. But I had not seen Sebastian Wyndham since we were both much younger, before my marriage, before everything had changed. I remembered him as a serious young man with a love of books and horses, quiet and somewhat awkward in social situations. He had married young, I knew, to a beautiful woman named Rosalind, who had died some years later under circumstances that no one spoke of directly. There had been whispers of illness, of tragedy, but I had been too preoccupied with my own troubles to pay much attention. Now here he was, the Earl of Hartwell, requesting an audience with the mysterious woman who had outbid him for Thornhaven Manor. I was not entirely certain I wanted to grant it. What matter of importance could he possibly wish to discuss? Did he suspect the truth about my identity? Was he planning to expose me, to cause some fresh scandal that would undo all the careful work of the past weeks? Emmeline, ever practical, urged caution. We know nothing of his intentions. She reminded me as we sat together in the small parlor that had become our temporary headquarters. He could be an enemy, Cordelia. He could be seeking information to use against you. But I found myself curious despite her warnings. There had been something in his face at the auction, some quality of attention that seemed different from the mere avarice of the other bidders. And I remembered, now that I had time to think about it, the young Sebastian Wyndham I had known in my youth. He had been a quiet presence at the edges of society gatherings, always watching, rarely speaking, with an air of melancholy that set him apart from the boisterous young men of our set. I had wondered about him then, had felt drawn to his reserve in a way I could not quite explain. But my parents had already been negotiating with Reginald's family, and I had been too young and too obedient to question the future they were arranging for me. Sebastian had married Rosalind Ashby the year after my own wedding, and I had heard nothing of him since except the whispered rumors of his wife's illness and death. But curiosity won out over caution, as it so often does, and I sent word that I would receive him the following afternoon. He arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as the invitation had specified, and I watched from an upstairs window as his carriage came up the drive. He had aged in the years since I had last seen him, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples and lines of care etched around his eyes and mouth. But he was still handsome. I noted with some surprise, still possessed of that grave dignity that had set him apart even in his youth. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned not to trust the ground beneath his feet, and when he dismounted from the carriage and looked up at the house, his expression was one of wary hope. I took a moment to compose myself before going down to receive him. The woman who would meet him today was not the frightened, desperate creature who had escaped from Briarcliff. She was the mistress of Thornhaven, a woman of property and position, and I would comport myself accordingly. I received him in the drawing room, which had been only partially furnished and still smelled faintly of fresh paint. He entered with a bow that was perfectly correct if somewhat stiff, and when he straightened and met my eyes for the first time, I saw recognition flicker across his face. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was deeper than I remembered, roughened by years and whatever sorrows he had endured. I was not entirely certain it was you until this moment. I considered denying it, considered maintaining the fiction of the mysterious continental widow a little longer. But there was something in his gaze, some quality of earnest honesty, that made deception feel both pointless and unkind. "Lord Hartwell?" I replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I suppose I should not be surprised that you recognized me. We did grow up as neighbors, after all." He sat, but his posture remained tense, his hands clasped before him as if he were steeling himself for an unpleasant task. I watched him struggle for words, wondering what could possibly require such obvious effort, and finally he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I owe you many apologies, in fact, but one in particular has been weighing on my conscience for some time." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious. "An apology? For what offense, my lord? I was not aware that we had any quarrel." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "We do not have a quarrel. The offense was not against you directly, but against someone you loved." "Your husband," he continued, and the word seemed to cost him something, "came to me 2 years ago seeking a loan. He was in desperate financial straits, and he knew that I had the means to help him. I refused. I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth of the afternoon. The implications of his words were beginning to take shape in my mind, forming a picture I had never considered. "You refused," I repeated slowly. "May I ask why?" Lord Hartwell met my gaze directly, and I saw the shadow of old anger in his eyes. "Because I knew what he was," he said. "I knew how he treated you. I had heard rumors, whispers from servants who had connections to my household, and I had seen enough with my own eyes to suspect the truth. The way he spoke to you at gatherings, the way you seemed to shrink in his presence, the bruises you tried to hide beneath your sleeves." He paused, his voice roughening. "I refused to give him money because I hoped that his financial ruin might somehow set you free." I sat very still, my thoughts racing. All this time, I had believed myself alone, had believed that no one saw what was happening behind the closed doors of my marriage, that no one cared enough to intervene. And here was this man, this neighbor I barely knew, telling me that he had seen, that he had cared, that he had even tried, in his own limited way, to help. "I did not know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know that anyone suspected." Lord Hartwell leaned forward, his expression intent. "I should have done more," he said. "I should have found a way to reach you, to offer assistance, to help you escape. Instead, I did nothing but refuse a loan and hope for the best, and then I heard that you had been committed to an asylum, and I thought I heard his voice crack slightly. I thought I had failed you entirely." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. I looked at this man who had carried the weight of guilt for 2 years, who had tried to buy Thornhaven at auction, perhaps hoping to preserve it for me, who had come here today not to expose me, but to confess his own perceived failures. And something within me, some frozen part of my heart that I had thought permanently damaged, began to thaw. "You did not fail me," I said gently. "You could not have known what he would do. No one could have predicted how far he was willing to go to silence me. But I should have tried," he insisted. "I should have found a way." I shook my head, a small, sad smile forming on my lips. "My lord, I have spent 2 years in an asylum, surrounded by women who were imprisoned by husbands and fathers and brothers who wished them silenced. I have seen how thoroughly the law protects men who wish to dispose of inconvenient wives. Even if you had tried to intervene, even if you had gone to the authorities with your suspicions, do you truly believe they would have listened? Do you believe they would have taken the word of a neighbor over the word of a duke?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his clasped hands. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that was almost pleading. "What can I do now?" he asked. "How can I make amends?" I considered the question carefully. There was nothing Lord Hartwell could do to undo the past, nothing that could give me back the 2 years I had lost or erase the memories of that cold asylum and its indifferent doctors. But the future, I was beginning to realize, was still unwritten. "You can be my friend," I said at last. "You can help me rebuild my life here. Help me navigate the society that will judge me for my husband's crimes. You can refuse to believe the rumors that will inevitably circulate, and you can extend to me the courtesy of being treated as a rational human being rather than a madwoman on probation." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first I had seen from him. "That," he said, "I can certainly do. And if anyone dares to question your sanity in my presence, they will find themselves answering to me." It was the beginning of something I had not anticipated, a friendship that would grow and deepen over the months that followed. Lord Hartwell, I discovered, was a man of many hidden depths. Behind his grave exterior lay a mind that was sharp and curious, a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly in conversation, and a capacity for kindness that seemed almost at odds with the reserve he presented to the world. He had suffered his own tragedies, I learned gradually, losses that had shaped him just as my imprisonment had shaped me. His wife, Rosalind, had died 5 years earlier after a long illness that had confined her to her bed for the last 2 years of her life. He spoke of her rarely and only in the most general terms, but I could see the shadow of that loss in his eyes, the way he sometimes seemed to retreat into memories that he did not share. They had had no children, and after her death, he had thrown himself into the management of his estate with a single-minded focus that his neighbors interpreted as coldness, but which I recognized as grief. One autumn evening, as we sat together in the newly furnished library at Thornhaven, he finally told me the full story of his marriage. Rosalind had been beautiful and vivacious when he met her, a young woman full of life and laughter who had seemed to light up every room she entered. He had fallen in love with her instantly, had courted her with all the passion of his quiet nature, and when she agreed to marry him, he had believed himself the luckiest man in England. But the illness had come only 2 years after their wedding, a wasting disease that the doctors could neither name nor cure. He had watched helplessly as the woman he loved faded away, her brightness dimming day by day, her body growing weaker while her spirit remained stubbornly intact. She had died in his arms, he told me, on a spring morning when the gardens outside her window were just beginning to bloom. I did not know what to say to such sorrow. My own suffering had been acute but brief compared to the long, slow agony of watching someone you love disappear before your eyes. I reached out and took his hand, and we sat there in silence as the fire burned low, 2 wounded souls finding comfort in each other's company. After that evening, something shifted between us. The formal distance that had characterized our early acquaintance gave way to a deeper intimacy, a sense of truly knowing and being known. We began to share not just the superficial matters of neighboring estates, but the deeper truths of our hearts. He told me of his dreams and disappointments, his fears and hopes, and I found myself confiding things I had never told anyone, not even Emmeline. We began to spend more time together as the summer progressed. He would call at Thornhaven to discuss matters relating to our neighboring estates, and I would invite him to stay for tea or dinner. He introduced me to the local society, vouching for my respectability and silencing the whispers that inevitably arose wherever I went. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, our friendship began to transform into something else. I did not recognize it at first, this warmth that spread through me whenever his carriage appeared on the drive, this flutter of anticipation I felt when I knew I would see him. I had been so damaged by my marriage, so thoroughly convinced that love was a trap designed to ensnare unwary women, that I could not identify the emotion when it first appeared. It was Emmeline who finally named it for me, one evening as we sat together in the newly furnished library. "You are in love with him," she said, and there was a gentle amusement in her voice that made me want to deny it immediately. "I am not," I protested, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they were false. "I am simply grateful for his friendship. He has been kind to me, that is all." Emmeline raised an eyebrow, in an expression I knew all too well. "Cordelia," she said patiently, "you light up like a candle whenever he enters a room. You spend hours choosing your gown before he visits. You quote his opinions as if they were holy writ. If that is not love, I do not know what is." I wanted to argue with her, but I could not find the words. The truth was that I had been afraid to examine my feelings too closely, afraid of what I might find if I looked beneath the surface of my carefully constructed composure. I had trusted once before, had given my heart to a man who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. How could I risk such vulnerability again? The memories of my marriage to Reginald came flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome. I remembered how charming he had been during our courtship, how attentive and solicitous, how he had made me feel like the most important woman in the world. I remembered the giddy excitement of our wedding day, the hope I had felt as we embarked on our life together, the naive belief that love would be enough to sustain us through whatever challenges lay ahead. And I remembered when the mask had first begun to slip, the small criticisms that grew into constant belittlement, the isolation from friends and family that he explained away as a desire to have me all to himself, the gradual erosion of my sense of self until I no longer knew where his desires ended and my own began. How could I be certain that Lord Hartwell was different? How could I trust my own judgment when it had failed me so catastrophically before? But Lord Hartwell was not Reginald. I knew that with a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence. He was kind where Reginald had been cruel, honest where Reginald had been deceitful, respectful where Reginald had been domineering. He listened when I spoke, valued my opinions, treated me as an equal rather than a possession. And when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made my heart race and my breath catch in my throat. I began to observe him more carefully after my conversation with Emmeline, searching for signs of the darkness that had lurked beneath Reginald's charming exterior. I noted how he spoke to his servants with courtesy and respect rather than condescension. I watched how he handled disagreements, with patience and a willingness to consider other points of view. I saw how he treated women in general, with the same dignity and attention he afforded to men. And slowly, gradually, I began to allow myself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love did not have to mean destruction. Perhaps there were men in this world who could be trusted, who would not use that trust as a weapon against the women who granted it. Perhaps Lord Hartwell was one of them. Still, I said nothing. I was too afraid of being wrong, too afraid of destroying the friendship we had built, too afraid of the vulnerability that love required. And so the summer passed into autumn, and the leaves began to turn gold and crimson on the trees of Thornhaven, and I continued to pretend that my feelings for Lord Sebastian Wyndham were nothing more than neighborly affection. It was he who finally broke the impasse, on an October afternoon that was so similar to the day I had been taken from Thornhaven that I had been fighting melancholy all morning. He found me in the garden, standing before the rose bushes that had been my grandmother's pride, and for a long moment he simply stood beside me in silence. "I have been trying to find the words for weeks," he said finally, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I have composed speeches in my head, eloquent declarations that seemed perfect when I imagined them, but that dissolve into nonsense whenever I try to speak them aloud." I turned to look at him, my heart beginning to pound. Lord Hartwell. "Ah, Sebastian," he interrupted gently. "Please, I think we have known each other long enough for Christian names." "Sebastian," I repeated, and the name felt strange and wonderful on my tongue. "What words have you been trying to find?" He met my gaze, and I saw in his eyes a vulnerability that I had never seen before, a rawness that stripped away all his careful reserve. "I have been trying to find a way to tell you that I love you," he said. "I have loved you for longer than I care to admit, perhaps since we were young, perhaps since the first moment I saw you at that auction and knew that you were not what you pretended to be. I love your courage and your resilience and your kindness. I love the way you laugh when you think no one is listening. I love the way you care for everyone around you while pretending that you need no one to care for you in return." I felt tears prickling at my eyes, but I could not look away from him, could not break the connection that seemed to vibrate between us like a plucked string. "Sebastian," I whispered, and I did not know what else to say. He reached out and took my hands in his grip warm and strong. "I know that you have every reason to distrust love," he continued. "I know that your husband betrayed you in ways that should make you wary of ever trusting a man again. But I am not him, Cordelia. I will never be him. And if you will give me the chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." I thought of Reginald, of the charming mask he had worn during our courtship, of the cruelty that had lurked beneath the surface. I thought of the asylum, of the cold walls and the indifferent doctors, of the long months when I had believed myself forgotten and abandoned. I thought of all the reasons I should be afraid, all the ways this could go wrong, all the pain that love had already cost me. And then I thought of Sebastian, of his kindness and his honesty and the way he had carried guilt for 2 years because he believed he had failed me. I thought of the friendship we had built, the conversations that stretched late into the evening, the comfortable silences that needed no filling. I thought of how safe I felt in his presence, how seen and valued and respected. "I love you too," I said, and the words came out stronger than I expected, clear and certain in the autumn air. I have been afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I do. I love you, Sebastian. The smile that broke across his face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, transforming his grave features into something radiant and young. He raised my hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, and the tenderness of the gesture made my heart ache with a sweetness I had forgotten was possible. "Will you marry me?" he asked, and his voice was steady now, all his nervousness burned away by the certainty of my response. "Will you be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things?" I should have hesitated. I should have asked for time to consider, should have insisted on a proper courtship, should have done all the sensible things that a woman of my experience ought to do. But I was done being sensible. I was done letting fear dictate my choices. I had spent 2 years in an asylum learning how precious freedom was, and now I intended to use that freedom to choose joy. "Yes," I said, and the word was a promise and a prayer and a declaration all at once. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you." He pulled me into his arms then, holding me as if I were something precious and fragile, and I felt the last frozen places in my heart finally begin to thaw. We stood there in the garden for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, while the autumn wind stirred the fallen leaves around our feet and the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold. When we finally drew apart, Sebastian's face was transformed by a joy so complete that it made him look years younger. "I never dared to hope," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought you could never trust again, not after what you had been through. I thought the best I could hope for was your friendship, and I had resigned myself to that. But this," he touched my face with trembling fingers, "this is more than I ever dreamed." I leaned into his touch, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. I had dreamed of it too, I admitted, more than I wanted to acknowledge, even to myself. But I was so afraid, Sebastian. I was so afraid of being wrong again. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said, "and I cannot promise you that I am perfect, Cordelia. I have my flaws and my failings, as all men do. But I can promise you this: I will never deceive you. I will never seek to control you. I will never, ever try to silence your voice or diminish your spirit. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life helping you shine." The engagement that followed was brief, by the standards of our social class. Neither Sebastian nor I saw any reason to delay our happiness, and the practical considerations that normally prolonged such matters had already been addressed by Mr. Harcourt. Our marriage would be a union of equals, our properties remaining separate, our voices equally weighted in all decisions affecting our households. It was an unusual arrangement, perhaps even a scandalous one, but we cared nothing for scandal. We had both learned that society's approval was a poor substitute for authentic happiness. The weeks before the wedding were filled with preparations that should have been stressful, but instead felt like a celebration. We chose furnishings together for the rooms at Thornhaven that would become our shared spaces. We planned the gardens that we would cultivate in the coming spring. We talked endlessly about our hopes for the future, our dreams and aspirations, the life we would build together. And through it all, I felt myself healing in ways I had not known were possible. The wounds of my past did not disappear, but they began to lose their power over me. In Sebastian's presence, I could speak of what had happened without shame. I could acknowledge my pain without being consumed by it. I could begin to see myself not as a victim, but as a survivor, someone who had endured the unendurable and emerged stronger on the other side. The wedding took place the following spring, in the chapel at Thornhaven that had witnessed the marriages of 6 generations of my family. Emmeline stood beside me as my witness, her eyes bright with happy tears, and Mr. Harcourt was there as well, looking decidedly pleased with himself for having played a part in this unlikely romance. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by those we trusted most, but it was everything I had ever dreamed a wedding could be. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed by Providence itself to bless new beginnings. I woke early and lay in bed listening to the birdsong outside my window, marveling at the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been a prisoner in an asylum, my future stretching before me like an endless gray corridor. Now I was about to marry a man who loved me, in the home I had fought so hard to reclaim, surrounded by the people who had never given up on me. Emmeline helped me dress in a gown of ivory silk that we had chosen together in London, its bodice embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the light like dewdrops. My grandmother's sapphire earrings hung from my ears, and around my neck I wore a simple gold locket containing a miniature portrait of my mother. These connections to the women who had come before me felt important somehow, as if their spirits were present to witness this new chapter of my story. The walk from the house to the chapel was short, just a path through the gardens that my grandmother had designed so many years ago. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air, and the hedges I had pruned and shaped over the past year formed a green corridor that led me toward my future. I carried a simple bouquet of white peonies from the cutting garden, their petals soft as silk against my trembling hands. As I walked down the aisle toward Sebastian, who waited at the altar with an expression of such tender joy that I could barely breathe, I thought of the journey that had brought me to this moment, the betrayal and the imprisonment, the despair and the escape, the auction and the reclaiming of my home. Every step of that journey, painful as it had led me here, to this chapel, to this man, to this second chance at happiness that I had never dared to hope for. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion that I can only partially recall. I remember the vicar's voice, sonorous and kind, speaking the ancient words that would bind us together. I remember the cool metal of the ring as Sebastian slipped it onto my finger and the warmth of his hand as he held mine. I remember the vows we spoke, promises of love and fidelity that seemed to echo through the small chapel like prayers ascending to heaven. "I do," I said when the time came, and the words were the most honest I had ever spoken. "I do," Sebastian replied, and his voice rang through the chapel like a bell, like a vow that would echo through all the years to come. When the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, Sebastian took my face in his hands and kissed me with a gentleness that made tears stream down my cheeks. The small congregation applauded, and Emmeline was weeping openly, and I remember thinking that I had never known it was possible to feel so much joy. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the dining room at Thornhaven, which I had finally finished furnishing just the week before. The table was laden with delicacies from our own estates and from the finest purveyors in London, and the champagne flowed freely as our guests toasted our happiness. I looked around at the faces gathered there, at Emmeline and Mr. Harcourt, at the handful of trusted friends who had stood by me through my darkest days, and I felt a gratitude so overwhelming that I could barely speak. The years that followed were not without their challenges, of course. Life rarely offers the kind of perfect happiness that exists in fairy tales, and Sebastian and I had our share of disagreements and difficulties, moments when the shadows of our respective pasts threatened to darken our present. But we faced those challenges together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had learned through hard experience the value of what they had found in each other. There were nights when Sebastian woke from dreams of Rosalind, his face wet with tears he tried to hide from me. There were days when I found myself trembling at an unexpected sound, my body remembering the fear of Briarcliff even when my mind knew I was safe. We learned to be patient with each other's wounds, to offer comfort without judgment, to trust that love was strong enough to hold us both. The first year of our marriage was spent in a state of quiet wonder as we explored the landscape of our new life together. We took long walks through the grounds of our neighboring estates, planning improvements and dreaming of the future. We spent evenings in the library, reading aloud to each other, or debating the merits of various poets. We entertained our neighbors cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence as society began to accept the reality of our union. There were those who whispered, "Of course, there always are." Some said I had bewitched Sebastian, had used some feminine wile to ensnare a grieving widower still vulnerable from his loss. Others suggested that our marriage was merely practical, a convenient arrangement between neighboring estates that had nothing to do with love. A few brave souls dared to repeat the old rumors about my supposed madness, suggesting that Sebastian had married a lunatic and would come to regret it. We ignored them all. What did we care for the opinions of people who had never troubled themselves to know us, who judged without understanding, who would rather believe the worst than extend the benefit of the doubt? Our happiness was our own, not subject to the approval or disapproval of polite society. Thornhaven flourished under our joint care, the empty rooms gradually filling with new furnishings and new memories. We hosted gatherings for the neighborhood, introduced reforms on our estates that improved the lives of our tenants, and created a home that was warm and welcoming and full of love. Emmeline remained my closest friend, eventually finding her own happiness with Mr. Harcourt, whose professional admiration had blossomed into something deeper during the years of our acquaintance. Hartwell Court and Thornhaven became like sister estates, united by the marriage of their masters and the bonds of friendship that linked our households. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the fire burned low and Sebastian sat reading beside me, I would think of the woman I had been when they carried me from this house, sedated and helpless and convinced that my life was over. I would think of the cold walls of Briarcliff, of the doctors who had declared me mad, of the husband who had betrayed me so thoroughly. And I would marvel at the distance I had traveled, at the strength I had discovered within myself, at the love that had found me when I had given up all hope of being found. They told the world I had lost my mind, but the only thing I ever lost was my faith in the man I married. And in the end, I found something far more precious than what I had lost. I found a home, I found a family, I found love, and I found myself. The autumn after our wedding, Sebastian and I stood together on the terrace of Thornhaven, watching the sun set over the hills of Yorkshire. The sky was painted in shades of gold and rose, and the air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and I thought that I had never seen anything so beautiful. "Are you happy?" Sebastian asked, his arm around my shoulders and his voice soft with contentment. I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. "I am," I said, "more happy than I ever thought I could be." He pressed a kiss to my hair, and we stood there in silence as the light faded and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the house behind us, I could hear Emmeline laughing at something Mr. Harcourt had said, and the sound of their joy mingled with our own, creating a harmony that seemed to fill the evening air. I thought of my grandmother, Lady Honoria, who had trusted no one and yet had trusted me enough to leave me the means of my own salvation. I thought of my mother, who had loved this house and these gardens, and who would have been proud, I hoped, of what I had made of the legacy she left me. I thought of all the women in that asylum, the ones who had no Swiss bank accounts and no loyal friends, the ones who were still imprisoned by husbands and fathers and a society that refused to hear their voices. I vowed silently to use my position, my resources, my hard-won freedom to help them however I could. But that was work for another day. Tonight, there was only this moment, this man, this life that I had fought so hard to claim. The stars were bright above Thornhaven, and the future stretched before us like a promise waiting to be kept. I was no longer the Duchess of Ravensdale, that title having died with Reginald. I was Lady Hartwell now, Countess and mistress of both estates, partner to a man who loved me and whom I loved in return. But more than any title, more than any estate, what I treasured most was the knowledge that I had survived. I had endured, I had overcome, and I had come home at last. As we turned to go inside, Sebastian paused and looked back at the sunset one more time. "Do you remember what you said to me?" he asked, "on the day I came to apologize for not doing more to help you?" I thought back to that afternoon in the half-furnished drawing room, to the dark-haired stranger who had become my dearest friend and then my beloved husband. "I said many things that day," I replied with a smile. "Which particular thing are you thinking of?" "You told me to be your friend," he said. "You told me to help you rebuild your life, to treat you as a rational human being rather than a madwoman on probation." He turned to face me, his eyes warm in the fading light. "I hope I have done that. I hope I have been worthy of the trust you placed in me." I reached up and touched his face, feeling the familiar planes and angles beneath my fingertips. "You have been more than worthy," I said. "You have been everything I never knew I needed." He caught my hand and kissed my palm, a gesture that still had the power to make my heart flutter even after all our time together. "Then let us go in," he said. "The evening is growing cold, and I believe Emmeline mentioned something about cards after dinner." I laughed, and the sound rang out across the terrace, free and unrestrained. "Cards it is," I agreed. "But I warn you, I intend to win." Sebastian grinned, a rare and wonderful expression that I had learned to cherish. "You always do, my love." You always do. And arm in arm, we walked back into the light and warmth of our home, leaving the gathering darkness behind us. The story of my escape from Briarcliff Asylum, of the auction and the £10 million and the mysterious veiled woman, became something of a legend in the years that followed. It was told in drawing rooms and whispered in servants' halls, embroidered and elaborated until the truth became almost unrecognizable beneath the layers of rumor and speculation. Some versions painted me as a wronged heroine, others as a cunning schemer, and still others as simply mad after all, my purchase of Thornhaven merely a symptom of my continued delusion. I did not trouble myself to correct the rumors. Let them believe what they wished, I decided. The people who mattered knew the truth, and that was enough. I had learned, in my time at Briarcliff, that reputation was a fragile thing, easily damaged and nearly impossible to repair. But I had also learned that it mattered far less than I had once believed. What mattered was not what people said about you when you left the room, but who you were when no one was watching at all. Emmeline and Mr. Harcourt were married the following June, in a ceremony at Hartwell Court that Sebastian and I hosted with great joy. Watching my dearest friend walk down the aisle toward the man who had helped to save me, I felt a sense of completeness that I had never expected to find. The circle was closing, the wounds were healing, and life was moving forward into brightness. Mr. Harcourt continued his legal work on behalf of wrongfully committed women, and with our support, he achieved significant reforms in the laws governing asylum admissions. No longer could a husband commit his wife on the word of a single physician. No longer could women be imprisoned indefinitely without recourse to the courts. The changes came slowly, as all changes do, but they came, and with each small victory, I thought of the women I had left behind in Briarcliff, and hoped that some of them, at least, might find their way to freedom. I threw myself into this work with a passion that surprised even me. Sebastian supported my efforts wholeheartedly, providing both financial resources and the social connections that gave our cause credibility. Together, we established a fund to provide legal assistance to women seeking release from wrongful confinement, and we lobbied Parliament for changes to the Lunacy Acts that would protect women from being imprisoned by vindictive husbands or greedy relatives. It was difficult work, and often frustrating. The men who held power in England were reluctant to cede any of it, and many of them genuinely believed that women were incapable of rational thought, that female hysteria was a real and dangerous condition requiring masculine control. But slowly, gradually, we began to change minds. Each woman we helped to freedom was a testament to the injustice of the current system. Each case we won in court was a precedent that made the next victory easier. I corresponded regularly with other women who had survived wrongful commitment, sharing our stories and strategies, building a network of survivors who understood what we had endured in a way that no one else could. Some of them became close friends, women I admired for their courage and resilience, women who had emerged from their ordeals, determined to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Lady Constance Whitmore had been committed by her father when she refused to marry the elderly earl he had chosen for her. Miss Harriet Pemberton had been imprisoned by her brother after she demanded her fair share of their parents' inheritance. Mrs. Dorothea Sinclair had been locked away by her husband when she discovered his embezzlement and threatened to expose him. Each story was different, but the underlying pattern was always the same. Women punished for daring to assert their rights, silenced by a system designed to protect male power at any cost. Together, we were stronger than any of us could have been alone. And though we could not undo the harm that had been done to us, we could work to ensure that future generations of women would not face the same injustice. As for Sebastian and me, we grew old together in the way that happy couples do, sharing joys and sorrows in equal measure, supporting each other through illness and loss, celebrating each anniversary as a gift we had never expected to receive. We never had children of our own, but we poured our love into our households, our tenants, our causes, and into each other. It was, I came to understand, more than enough. It was everything. On the last evening of my story, I sit once again on the terrace of Thornhaven, watching the sun set over the hills of Yorkshire. Sebastian has been gone for 3 years now, taken by a fever that came too quickly for any doctor to cure, and I miss him with an ache that never quite fades. But I am not alone. Emmeline is here, her hair silver now but her spirit undimmed, and the house behind me is full of the people I love, the family I have chosen, the life I have built from the ruins of the one that was taken from me. I think of that young woman who walked into Christie's auction hall in a black veil and bought back her home for £10 million. I think of the courage it took, the desperation and the hope and the fierce refusal to be defeated. I think of all the years that have passed since that day, all the happiness and the heartache, all the love and the loss, and I know, with a certainty that goes beyond words, that every moment of it was worth it. They told the world I had lost my mind, but I found it again in the end. I found my mind and my heart and my home, and I lived, as all good stories promise, happily ever after. Not because there was no more pain, no more sorrow, no more struggle, but because I had learned that happiness is not the absence of suffering. It is the presence of love and courage and the willingness to keep going even when the way is dark. The sun sinks below the horizon, and the stars begin to appear, one by one, in the deepening sky. I rise from my chair and turn toward the light spilling from the windows of Thornhaven, toward the voices and laughter of the people waiting for me inside. I am Cordelia Ashworth, Lady Hartwell. I was once a duchess, and then a prisoner, and then a ghost, and finally, at last, myself. And this is my story, told in my own words, from beginning to end. I hope you have found it worth the telling.